We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadrome. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia. If you don't know where that is, look it up on a map. It's not in the U.S. state of Georgia. Well, it's still October. I've got one more horror-related video. Not that I'm a person who thinks we should do everything according to the mood of the month, although it is sometimes nice. Particularly, I do like dark things in October. But what we're going to do today is we're going to have a discussion with my friend James Wallace from the channel 20th Century Music and Arts about what is and what isn't horror. And the interesting thing about that is that I've noticed over, say, the last 20 years or so, that people, often on the internet, on YouTube or something, will, in the comments section or something, they'll hear you mention something and you say, "Ooh, that was a horror film." And then they'll say, "That's not horror." And then give you an illustration of what they think it is, often thrillers, which I find much harder to nail down as a genre than horror. Horror has multiple encyclopedias, photo books, books on directors, books on sociology, books on philosophy, documentaries. I have more horror documentaries than I do documentaries on film itself as a film history. So horror we know, but thrillers, there is no thriller encyclopedia. I've got one book back in Alaska that's about thrillers, and that's it. So what's a thriller? Anyway, we'll discuss that. Before we get into the dialogue, I just want to point out that I am officially, as of this moment, starting to sell a book to raise money for the channel. And the book is something I made up. I actually had this printed back in 2017 when I suddenly realized, for reasons that would take too long to explain right now, that I had to leave my home, and that eventually led me to living here. Someone left me a message. I printed up this book. I got 150 copies made. I had them sent to my house. A few, I didn't sell any, but a few of them I gave away. And then I put them in a box, and then that box was left in Alaska in my storage facility until this year. So, what is that, 7 years? Quite a while. And then what I did is I rescued them. So I have a few here, which I can't mail them off from here very easily. But I sent 50 copies to America and 30 copies to the UK for Europe and East. So the American ones can also go for South America and Canada. But here's the thing. If you want a copy of this book, $25. Look at this. It's called 3 Motions. Motions was an old word for puppets back in the time of Shakespeare. And they used to call the puppeteers the motions men. And this has one called The Definition of Fun, which is a very dark piece. Another one called Every Puppet. And a third one called 21st Century Faust. And there's 50 pages here, 3 plays that you could put on. If you want more than one, we could make a deal. Get in touch with me through the email. But here's the point, is that this is, I need to make money for the channel. I don't make any money from YouTube. I don't make any money through any Patreon type service yet. Although I looked into Patreon. It didn't look sustainable. And now I'm looking into locals. So I'll do something like that. But the point is this, I'm hemorrhaging money even doing these because I spend so much time doing them that I can't do anything else, like finishing writing my book. So I need to build up my financial resources. And I've only got 30 of these in Europe and 50 of these in America. They're all numbered and signed, and when they're gone, they're gone. So if you want one, there'll be a PayPal link down below. Make sure you put the word book. Otherwise, I'll just consider it a normal contribution and won't do anything to it. It's got to be $25, and that'll cover the shipping, and that'll cover, I suppose it's worth a little bit more than the book is. But you know what? This is all there is of the book. There are no more. So 80 books up for sale. This is your last chance. When they're gone, they're gone. Actually, it's 79 because I owe one to someone already. So, okay. We're done with that. Let's go to James and a discussion of that's not horror, or is that horror? What is horror, or what is not horror? Well, welcome back, James Wallace, for another discussion today about horror films. I think the question is, what is horror and what is not horror? And I've been noticing this for a while, that if you mention certain films, someone will say immediately, that's not horror, to which I'm going like, wait a minute. And we'll talk about what those films might be. But you did that to me in a discussion not too long ago. And I remember saying, okay, and we both said, let's put that down as something to discuss. So, well, how are you doing up there in Canada?
Oh, pretty good. It's actually really warm today. It's like 22 degrees in October. So, it's t-shirt weather. So, no, we're doing pretty good.
It's colder here today. It's like 15 Celsius. So, yeah. For me in Alaska, that's like still t-shirt weather.
Yeah, for sure.
And I walk around, and there are people here. I mean, when it was 20 degrees, they're starting to shiver.
Yeah. If you're not used to
as a Canadian, that must be pretty funny too.
Yeah.
So let's. I have an entire video where I talk about horror genres.
Yeah,
and I'll mention a little bit of my categorization of horror. But let's start off. How do you see horror? What is a horror film? Is there something you can say that isn't a horror film that maybe someone else might? But start off with what you think is a horror film.
Okay, so first and foremost, a horror film has to contain an element of fear. But along with that fear has to be a big sense of the vulnerable. Like if there's a complete inversion of the general order of things to become horror. So an example of this would be why we have to have the vulnerable. So if you took Halloween with Michael Myers and you put that in the crime-ridden inner city with people carrying guns, it would not be a horror film anymore. There would be the reason that it was put in the sort of safe suburbs and this entities come in that's killing people, that has the vulnerable element. So there has to be fear and there has to be a sense of vulnerability.
Right. So a film about mafia assassins would not be a horror film.
No, it might be horrific in content. So you have that scene in Casino where he puts the guy's head in a vice, for example, Joe Pesci, I think, does. That's a horrific scene. But I wouldn't say that's not a horror movie. Mm-hmm. So there has to be that vulnerable. Now, traditionally, horror movies did, or at least the vast majority of them, did have that element of the supernatural. The exception seems to be the psychotic killer films.
Right, which is Up until Psycho was fairly rare. The earlier one would be M by Fritz Lang.
That's right. Yes, and there's always been this but even that what we're dealing with there when someone's a complete psycho is you have that complete inversion of order, of normalcy. And that's what was represented by, say, like the supernatural in most horror films. That's now being represented by somebody who's a complete psychotic killer. Mm-hmm. Now, I guess this is the discussion where we have to kind of look at things. And this conversation is actually a bit more complicated than I first thought it was. So my questions would be like, what separates horror from a thriller? Because there's a big crossover there.
But here's my question about that.
Yeah.
What is a thriller?
Yeah, so that's a good point too. I mean, a thriller, obviously, it creates a lot of excitement and anxiety like a horror movie does, but does it necessarily have the same degree of vulnerability that you would have with horror? And is there the same degree of darkness? So then, similar to a thriller would be crime, right? So the big discussion about Silence of the Lambs, which is in some ways, a lot of ways, a horror movie for sure, but in some ways it isn't, or at least it's not functioning as the horror movie traditionally did in many ways. And it's something new that gets birthed in the early 90s.
What about something that is clearly two genres or maybe three? So for instance, Alien, I file it under science fiction because first of all, it's happening in space in a spaceship, and it has an alien creature. Secondly, it's obviously a horror film just as well.
Well,
and then, if you get to Aliens, you have the added element of action.
Okay, Aliens is not a horror movie. Alien is a horror movie. Aliens with an S, no, that's an action movie as far as I'm concerned.
See,
so that's what I would say. Action movies can have elements.
I have my hard disks on the wall.
Yeah.
Action is not a category I can use because there isn't an action film that can't be filed under science fiction, historical, crime. And in fact, when you look up on Wikipedia, some guy did a theory. He said it was one of the 7 major genres, but he admitted there isn't an action film. I talked about on my video about horror genres, the difference between a subject genre like vampires, werewolves, zombies, and mood genres like K horror or J horror or found footage horror or Universal monsters are all more mood horror. They have a specific mood that they're being shot out of. Like you could have there are things that are considered action horror, but to me, for instance, if you bring out a lot of guns and a car chase, but it's happening with vampires, as some of the films in the 90s were, is what's Blade? To me, Blade is first and primarily a vampire movie.
Yes, but I wouldn't call that an
action movie. And I have the same problem with thrillers. People say Silence of the Lambs. And I got this actually in one of the comments below my horror genres. Some guy just, did the usual. Silence of the Lambs is not a horror film. It's a thriller. The guy said, you don't need to create a separate subgenre for it. And I said, I didn't. I have a very large genre called psycho killers. It fits pretty well in there. But here's the thing I thought about, and it's been coming to me more and more. I keep hearing the word thriller, and I'm going like, what the hell's a thriller? Because it's the category that most people will default to out of horror. And
I mean, think of some of the Hitchcock stuff. Definitely is thriller as opposed to horror.
Although he used the word suspense film.
Yeah, suspense is another one.
Which to me makes perfect sense to differentiate it from a mystery. So in a mystery or whodunit, someone commits a crime. Now we need to find out who did it. And so along the lines, you could have someone in a house trying to figure it out, which would be just a basic crime film. Or you could have a police procedural out of it, which then would take it into, that's definitely a crime film. Yeah. But I think both of them are crime films. But so the suspense film for Hitchcock was, well, we're not trying to show you a whodunit here.
Yeah.
I think Hitchcock has one or two whodunits, but he says, we know who did it, generally. And for instance, Hitchcock famously said, here's a suspense film. Two people are sitting at a table in a restaurant, and they're both talking. And there's been some vague threat in the air. He goes, that's not a suspense film. Here's a suspense film. Two people are talking in a restaurant, and we know what they don't know, that there's a bomb under the table that's going to go off.
Mm-hmm.
So I think most people today would call that some sort of thriller. But thriller to me seems like a newer category that's kind of like a catch-all for anything that has elements of suspense or the chase.
But definitely without the supernatural.
Yeah.
So,
although I've heard of people talk about certain horror films because, see, to me, Aliens is still first and foremost a science fiction film. I would be able to.
Yeah, it's a science fiction
nowhere
film.
else. Secondly, I would classify it as a horror film still because it's got monsters.
Not so much.
And monsters are by nature horrifying. They're part of the horror tradition.
Yes, but when
thirdly, it is an action film, to which I would say whatever the hell that is. It's got a lot of guns and explosions. That's all I know about action film.
Yeah, it's post Rambo, Commando, those sort of action films I remember growing up with in the 80s, the big guns shooting. So they're applying that into the science fiction. What I would say is the difference is in you have the one alien who's picking people off in the first film, and the way the alien stalks Sigourney Weaver in the final. It's just got a very different dynamic in Aliens, because you have all these military guys fighting back the aliens using conventional sort of action and guns.
Yeah,
so I don't think it operates in the same way. But of course, this is an interesting discussion, because we also have other things that you've talked about with other crossover genres. So if I watch a movie about the horrors in the Holocaust, I would not call that a horror film. The content is horrific.
Unless
a horror film.
It had a supernatural element.
Yes, maybe, but
you're not going to put World War II zombies in the World War II section.
Okay, I was thinking more. Sorry, I'll be more clear. I was thinking something because you brought up Salo in the horror genre, and I would say Salo is one of the most horrific films. My friend from Poland said, "Don't see that movie. There's images in that movie that will never leave your mind again." But I wouldn't call that. I call that a highly disturbing movie. I wouldn't call that.
It is, but there, I don't have a category for highly disturbing movies. I go almost purely by subject. And when I look at the subject, I see a group of people controlling horrific, terrifying events. That's why, for me, it's the OG of the Cabal category. And the Cabal films are when you have not necessarily a cult, although there's some cults are big enough to qualified, but it's a film. It doesn't usually have a supernatural. It shouldn't have a supernatural element, or if it does, we don't know if it's real or not. But it's a larger group of people who are in control of a scenario, which results in horror after horror. To me, it is the group version of the solo psycho killer.
Okay, I know what you're saying. Like, there's interesting films like that, like The Believers and things like that. That's more of kind of a cult, I guess. But
that's also basically a witchcraft film.
Yeah. But the thing with Salo is it was very specific political commentary that the director, who ends up getting killed in real life.
Oh, yeah. I know the whole story. I have the video.
Yeah,
but to me, it is almost, it's a group of people are invited somewhere and then tortured.
Yeah, but I don't consider that doesn't really function on how, because again, you don't have.
Well, we have a whole category for torture and gore.
Yes,
I put most of those in the psycho killer section, but something like Hostel is a Cabal film because it's a group of people controlling the terror. And so I can understand why a person would say Salo isn't a horror film. I can understand that. But at the same time, it's kind of the first major type of its species, although you could go back to Manchurian Candidate or something like that. But I think that's more directly a political film. Whereas in this film has no political agenda, apart from saying Nazis are bad, but that can happen anywhere.
Well, he was talking about the fascist governments in Italy and what happened there.
Right.
So that was his commentary.
But that's not the film is. I mean, you'd never say, if you want to see a movie about bad Nazis, watch, or fascists, watch that film, because it's just so far beyond that.
I think that's what he was trying to do. I mean, there was another movie I could do a comparison with, and I've never seen the American version of this, but the 1998 Austrian film Funny Games.
Although that's just film. Two guys, and fortunately, I don't have to worry about that. I don't have that film yet. But I have a collection of the director's work, Michael Haneke. Yeah. So when I get it, fine, I'll put you over here. I don't have any more films by Pasolini. So when I do, he will go down there, and we won't have to worry about that.
Yeah, no, but what I'm saying in that film was actually extremely interesting because he was making a commentary on how we are detached to horrors and human suffering in real life, and but
that film shows up all the time on horror lists. When I watch people's top 10 horror lists, that shows up all the time. Just as I've got horror cinema here by Tash out of Germany, and Silence of the Lambs. You'd be hard pressed not to find a book that doesn't include Silence of the Lambs as
horror. And I will accept Silence of the Lamb is a horror film. Though
it's got cannibalism, it's got psycho killers, it's got gore, it's got like underlying tensions and stuff. It's just I just watched it the other day and I said it's kind of a procedural, but a thing can be both at once. So Kill List, I think, and I don't think you've probably seen this film yet, but it's a film that came out about 10 years ago. Absolutely brilliant film. Starts off as an assassin film. If I were going by the first 2/3 of the film, I'd put it in the crime section where I put my other assassin films. But then comes the last third of the film, in which I'm not going to spoil it, but you really should watch it. It is a great film. But suddenly the whole thing is turned inside out, and you realize all of this has been controlled. And controlled by some pretty crazy people. So suddenly, and again, that film will show up time after time in horror lists. And we've seen more of these films that are kind of on the edge of genres, more than one genre, sometimes 3 or 4 genres mixed together. And I think that's where we are.
We are definitely in an area where things have changed and altered. And I've been thinking about this. Why? For horror to work, there has to be a buy-in from the audience. Yeah. And what the audience buys into changes with the historical era you're living in. So what do I mean by this? If you are living in the 1930s and 40s, those Universal Hammer horror films are something you can buy into. By the time you're in the 70s, you can't buy into that anymore. So the horror movies are different in terms of what people buy into. Right. What I think we have been in since post, and I'm going to blame this guy for a lot of problems, Quentin Tarantino. Okay. We are in this post Tarantino world where, because there's no sense of the sacred, the buy-in is much more difficult. So that's why I think you do have the films like The Hostel, where they just bring out the most disturbing violence and they ratchet it up so high because that's what will shock people.
Right.
I think it would be very difficult to actually produce something genuinely frightening in the same way that The Exorcist was frightening in the early 70s. Right.
My feeling is that a lot of people today, and this seems to be coming more from Gen X and older millennials, they're the ones who will often say that's not horror about things. And I think one of the reasons they do is because they grew up in that post-Exorcist world, post-Texas Chainsaw world, post-Halloween world, post-Friday the 13th world, where you had a very certain kind of a film that was a horror film. I did not. So my definitions of what a horror film are radically different from that. I tend to look at all of those, they're essentially boogeyman films, as being kind of they're interesting. I loved the first of most of those films, although Friday the 13th, whatever. But Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and such, I like certainly the first of those films. But I don't look at them as particularly a great style of filmmaking. And although there's a new one out, I don't know if you've heard of the Terrifier series.
Yeah, I saw the first one.
Yeah, well, the first one, I have a double set. The second one is such an improvement on the first one. And the third one, which is in theaters now, is making all sorts of money because it's come into its own. I think the first one was just more or less him. Oh, I've got $250,000 now. Or no, that was the second one. It's like, I've got $10,000, and that he made the first film. So, but no, Art the Clown has become this amazing thing. And I watched the second one the other day. Unfortunately, it's not coming here, so I'll have to wait to buy a copy in a month, probably at the beginning of the year or something. But this year has proved to me to be perhaps the best year for horror films I've ever seen. And it's just Longlegs, The Substance, Late Night with the Devil. There's all these incredible films. I mean, I thought Longlegs was the best. Then The Substance came along, and I said, "Oh, wow," And I'm debating which one is better. But they're all pushing different boundaries, and I think it's just an interesting time. But you'll notice in the video I just dropped about old films that are worth looking at now. And if you notice in that, I said this is specifically for younger millennials and Gen Z. And the reason is because most of these won't raise the same kind of chills for people who are Gen Xers and older millennials and people my age as they will for younger people, because many of these films have this creepy factor, which I'm fairly immune to as a source of horror. I love the imagery, but it doesn't scare me. Whereas I've noticed younger people, you saw the whole Slender Man?
Yeah.
And I just sat there and going like, this isn't scary. Why are you getting scared? But I realized they're afraid of things we aren't afraid of. And one of the things, for instance, they're afraid of masks, and COVID helped that. Then they're afraid of puppets, dolls, clowns, which show up in many of this year's most important horror films.
Yeah, that's been around for a while, though, the fear of clowns and things like that.
Not that long.
Early 80s, I would say it started. The Poltergeist clown scene was probably the first one I can think of.
The whole fear of clowns things doesn't predate 1980, as far as movies go.
Yeah, I would say that's probably true.
Yeah, and it was Stephen King that really gave it a boost. Yeah, there's a poltergeist clown. It's really a doll.
Yeah.
But, yeah, and I've got these clown books. One is a survey of clowns, and the other is an encyclopedia of clowns. One is from 1980. The other is from, I think, 1990. Neither one. No, I think it's 80 and 70, but neither one has even a whisper about anyone being afraid of clowns. And so this is a very recent fear, which is what I'm going to get to eventually in my Cute and the Creepy series, where I talk about creepy stuff. To me, people who are much younger than us grew up in a world of digital imagery. Video games, CGI in movies and stuff like this. The images are cute and kind of plastic and shiny. And so for them, a handmade Halloween mask from the beginning of the 20th century is really terrifying to them, which is what would make the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari very creepy and weird for them. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and there's another thing that's actually very interesting too, is why something like Nosferatu holds up, and I've shown that to people, and they get freaked out by the imagery in there.
Exactly.
Is the other factor is, And I'll give two kind of different examples. If you take out one of the sensory elements, so in the sense, in silent film, you don't have the sound of the people.
Right.
I mean, they'll play music or whatever. You're filling in the blanks yourself. And I remember I used to listen to really old horror radio shows. Ones like, there's one called The Sealed Book. And I remember, and I was listening to these in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and these used to freak me out because the visual element's taken out. Right. So you're filling in the gaps yourself. And even though this was quite old stories, they were actually quite freaky.
Yeah.
So I think...
I understand exactly what you're saying. I have in my vinyl collection quite a few of both old radio shows and readings from novels. And to hear H.P. Lovecraft being read by someone like Roddy McDowall is chilling.
Yeah, for sure.
You're conjuring up the whole thing in your mind.
Yeah, and that's why reading those books is also freaky, because you're conjuring it up in your mind. But with so much of horror, when it's, I remember my friend bought, when we were little kids, he bought one of the Fangoria magazines, and we thought this thing was so freaky as a kid.
Right.
We were really young, but it was that obsession with gore that kind of turned horror, not on purpose, but by the end of the 1980s, so much of horror had become comedy. Right. And the most brilliant version of that is Evil Dead 2. Right?
Exactly. Well, yeah, and then the Chucky films and later Nightmare on Elm Street films.
Yes.
Only Michael Myers seemed not to be funny, and maybe have suffered because of that,
Well, there's been some really bad ones with him, though, too.
Yeah.
What's the one with Busta Rhymes having a martial art fight with him at the end of the movie? That was pretty horrible.
There's bad, and then there's bad. But what's interesting about this book I have here is, can you guess the next film after Silence of the Lambs that they have in here? So Silence of the Lambs is 91. Can you guess what this survey of horror, the next major film they have?
Oh, in terms of, is that in chronological order by year?
Yes, it is.
So we're talking 90s. 90s. One thing I want to say about the 90s is, just like the way that sort of underground music got mainstreamed, but then so many genres that were really interesting and underground got pushed out. So, for example, thrash metal gets pushed out by the new grunge sound.
Right.
A lot of the conventions from horror by the early 90s are being used. So things like Pacific Heights, arachnophobia, I don't know, even like Sleeping with the Enemy, even things like Ghosts. So they're doing that genre kind of bending, but they're taking very safe stances. It's not like Jason's relationship with his mother or Michael Myers' relationship with his older sister. It's not like the Twisted Family, and they're doing something very safe. So they're doing a lot of the conventions of the horror, but they're mainstreaming it. But sorry, I digress here. I would say it would either be, probably not going to be Candyman, but that's actually one of the few good horrors from the early 90s. I would say Scream or Blair Witch Project.
Scream followed by the Blair Witch Project, which is interesting because this is 96. So it's a whole 5-year gap. But what I was getting to here, though, was by pointing this out, was that what happened, you mentioned that by the end of the 80s, you had this whole thing happen with horror, and there was a lot of horror comedy. Mm-hmm. But this thing just kept grinding on, and they kept putting out, sequel after sequel.
Yep.
And after a while, I remember, 96 was like a graveyard before Scream arrived. There were interesting films. Like, I liked the films of Brian Usna, who did all these really crazy. I just watched his 88 film or something called Society. And I watched that because it struck me, I think this is a lot like The Substance, this weird body horror stuff.
Not familiar with that film.
Yeah, Substance is just absolutely crazy. Substance and Longlegs, if you're going to see two this year, see those two.
Okay.
And then suddenly, to me, things started getting interesting again. But you went through this period of teen horror films at the end of the 90s. Which kind of ran out of steam fairly quickly. But then the J-horror kind of came in, the found footage horror. Although, in looking back at the record, Blair Witch Project comes out, and then there really isn't another good, important horror film till like 4 or 5 years later of Paranormal Activity.
Yeah, that was really well done.
Yeah. And then that started the rush for
well, yeah, and the original one that is the original found footage horror film is this one Italian movie called Cannibal Holocaust.
Yeah. I've got a copy of that.
Where they think they actually did an investigation because they thought it was. The director told the actors to go into hiding. So they thought it was real.
The DVD I have of it has a lot of supplemental material talking about all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Was that Lenzi? It wasn't Fulci. But anyway, one of these.
I know I forget the name.
But I think that, I saw one the other day. It was a TV thing. I got a copy of it. It happened to be a second video. It was called Ghost Watch, and it was done as a kind of a British television production.
Yeah. I know that one. Yeah.
And it's a found footage thing, but it's presenting itself as an investigation, as a mockumentary. And what's interesting about that is Late Night with the Devil that came out this year really goes into the mockumentary thing, and they really do a pretty good job. It's not 100% good, but a pretty darn good job of recreating a 70s television set, and then have all this stuff happening live. So, and it's pretty well done.
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that so much of what the horror that you could pull off before, you couldn't pull off now in the age of the phone. So, for example, you could only do, I don't know, Michael Myers or Jason the Lone Killer coming after you with, we're in northern Canada and the phone, there's no Wi-Fi service, or the phone's fell in the lake or something.
Exactly.
Then you can do that. Otherwise, Jason ends up on Instagram.
Yeah. Well, I had in my novel, which I'm going to keep set in 2010, I had 8 people stuck on a small Alaskan island, and horrific things ensue. But there's only one person whose phone works, and it's a guy who's an FBI agent, and he drops it into the water. You have to get rid of the phone. Nowadays with Starlink, even that, sat phones were very uncommon then. Yeah. Now anyone can connect through the satellites. And if it's still not as common as a normal cell phone, but still the excuses are getting less. But then again, it strikes me you can do all sorts of things with cell phones as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. David Cronenberg with Videodrome, he really kind of prefigured a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
Technology, you become part of technology. It's interesting. I guess the other thing I was going to say, I really looked at horror is something that also has to, and maybe this is why the buy-in changes or the type of horror changes, is it has to represent the anxieties of the time, right? So
that's why horror is good now, because we've got so many anxieties.
Yeah, well, that's probably quite true. Yeah, that's quite true. Mm-hmm. But things operate sort of differently within horror. But yeah, I don't know why. I mean, it's the only genre movie I really watch these days, and I still go back to just relentlessly watching it. And
well, the films I've been seeing in the theaters, I've come to a conclusion that independent cinema is largely irrelevant now, or not being made. But the horror films are where the action is. And it's a weird time. So people with really interesting outlooks are making really interesting films. They don't appeal to everyone, but there's something for everyone. And here's my question. And what I've noticed is, it was the other day I was watching, I think, was it Nerdrotic? Yeah. And they were going over no, it wasn't. It was Chris Gore's Film Threat channel. And they were going over someone's list of the top 100 horror films of all time. Mm-hmm. And there were some things in the list that made me go, really? But at the same time, everyone there, for instance, as soon as they mentioned Jaws, everyone said, no, that's not a horror film. And that was actually number one. And Whereas, like I say, I have it safely ensconced in the adventure section, but it's adventure horror, I think. But I think the adventure part is a bit more in your face, you know.
Yeah, for sure. The horror element came in because they had problems with the actual shark that they were using, and so they had to kind of turn it into a horror.
You know, all the cannibal jungle films are basically jungle adventures first. They are the apocalyptic mode of the old Tarzan film.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
And they are jungle, you know, it's just so you can have it shark films. Unless there's a really heavy element of science fiction, most of them are just, you know, water films, ocean films. And, you know, you have your shark. And the shark is horror, but I keep them all together. They seem happy in the adventure section. So
yeah, I mean, again, this is an interesting debate. Like, where does one genre end and one begin? I mean, that's always the discussion. Like,
but I never have any problems if someone says Jaws a horror film. I don't go, it's an adventure film, because I think it can be both. And I think Jaws is perfectly horrifying. And if you see the film in a theater, people will all be screaming at certain moments. So, and this was certainly true when it first came out, and people stopped going to the beach. But here's the thing I've noticed is because of the escalation of imagery, a lot of the Universal films, people will say, well, that's not horror. And I'm sitting there going like, it's kind of the definition, you know? I mean, yeah, maybe it doesn't scare you, but at one point when I listened to my mother talking about going to those films in the 30s, she was terrified.
Yeah. So I guess there is that buy-in. Like, I remember when they had the re-release of The Exorcist in 2000, and apparently, again, I'm putting the blame on Quentin Tarantino again, destroying the sacred with irony. But apparently, you know, people were writing things. I couldn't believe most people in the theater were laughing, you know, when The Exorcist was being played. Now, that wasn't the reaction in 73, 74. Sure. By 2000, people are laughing. So I think there was a sense of the buy-in.
I think people laugh now, and I noticed this even in the 70s when I saw Taxi Driver, and there's the final bloody shootout scene. And the first time I saw it, I'd walked in halfway. I'd come to see another film that was there, but a Taxi Driver was there, and someone had said, that's a really good film. So I wanted to see it, but I missed the first part. And I'm sitting there watching it, and there are these guys cackling away at the bloody scene. Now, looking back, I think these guys were probably film buffs, or else they were high. And, you know, they just said, you know, it was so over the top for them and bloody that they didn't have another reaction because they were far too cool to be upset by it. Whereas I was genuinely upset by it. I'd never seen anything like that before.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, you have to give yourself to the narrative of the film. This isn't horror related, but when I was in my second year of university, I took 2 film courses. One was called Italian Cinema Neorealism to Present, and then the second one was just called Film Art and Introduction. Well, the Italian cinema film was a very small class,
right?
And we'd watch a film and then dissect it the next class. It was great, Fellini films, all kinds of things. But we had De Sica's Bicycle Thief, and I'm in there, and there's a lot of big guys of Italian background who took the course too. And at the end of the movie, they're all teared up and crying. We watched that same movie a few months later in Film Art, which was in this big auditorium. There's maybe 1,000 people in there, and everyone's sitting there with the Doc Martin. I mean, this is 1994. This is Quentin Tarantino, and
it's too late.
94, 95. Like it's the era of Pulp Fiction, and everyone was laughing at that final scene, and I was so pissed off. I remember at the time. Like nothing was safe.
No, I've sat through movies, even in the late 70s. They would show a Humphrey Bogart movie or something. We had this great movie theater in Petaluma, California, the Plaza Theater, that would show 2, sometimes 3 movies all at once. If the older movies were short, you know, they'd show maybe 3 of them. And there would be people laughing at those, which is why on my, 10 kind of antique films younger people should watch, I suggest do not watch this on a phone.
Yeah.
Do not watch this with other people.
Yes.
because I don't think it would be very hard. We've gotten used to the idea of sitting in our rooms and commenting on things as things go by. Whereas some of these films work if if you got someone who will be quiet, that's one thing. But if you've got people who want to, stop and interrupt the film or just wait a minute, I got to go to the bathroom and all this kind of stuff, it's not going to work the same because these things are so moody. What the youngins today would call creepy, and that's the interesting thing. Creepy is a category for them that it isn't for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of these films have that element, which is what I was focusing on. And to me, that's a good way to get into older films. If there's an element now that you can say to someone, go check these films out. Now, there are other films from the same period that don't quite have the same level of this creepy quality. But I think that since younger people are so unnerved, it's amazing how many times I've heard people say, yeah, dolls and puppets and all this really freaks me out. And I'm sitting there going like, really? Are you that much of a wimp?
No,
but I understand it. They live in a world of plastic, quote unquote, perfect imagery. And so to see these old handmade things, handmade Halloween costumes, handmade dolls, handmade things that don't look like the things around you. At the same time, these people would think nothing about going to get a Halloween costume and buying a perfect replica of a horror icon and seeing it as a mask on someone. They wouldn't think that was creepy at all.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You have what were you saying about the Funko Pop version of Leatherface or something?
Exactly. I've seen images of that. I'm going like, really?
Yeah.
You have a cute version of Leatherface? Although I will say, in Texas Chainsaw, the 1974 original, that film holds up so well.
Absolutely.
Because no matter who watches it, they think they're cool. You put that on and they're starting to go like, oh my God, is this, how do we get out of this film?
Yeah, no, you got it. There's definitely a buy-in, right when you see what's inside that house, for sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it starts with the quote-unquote grisly work of art at the beginning in the graveyard. And then I think, what's the guy? Ed O'Neill, the hitchhiker with the weird port wine stain on his face. That guy is so weird.
Yeah, for sure.
And as soon as you get him out, you're just immediately going like, ugh, because he really feels like he's, there's something really real and scary about the guy.
Yeah, definitely. But you know what? I'm not a fan. We'll call it TP, so we don't use what the stands for.
I just call it extreme gore.
I liked the first Saw, but it bothered me too, because even though he's saying, yes, these are bad people that need to be judged, ultimately that person is the worst person in the film, and you do want to see that coming to an end. Like, you do want to see that triumph and the everything that's been disrupted. You want to see that order come back. I mean, that's how traditional horror did work, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's just me, though.
I've watched a great majority of the extreme gore films from the aughts, and I've watched Art the Clown, which makes all of those look like. But Art the Clown is pure Grand Guignol. It is pure, and that was the old French theaters that started in the turn of the centuries, went up to the 1960s, where the whole point was to watch a film where real blood, supposedly real, was happening on the stage, and I think it works on that level. And when you get to the second film, and I haven't got to the third one yet, but I know from listening to interviews with the director Damien Leone, it's definitely in there. There becomes a whole battle of good and evil kind of thing that starts to develop, which isn't there so much in the first one at all. The
first one had that aughts morality that I didn't quite like he's chewing on her face and stuff, and it's like, you get more of that. She's becoming sort of the killer, and
right. But It is interesting. He's made an iconic character to rival, at this point, it rivals Michael and Freddy and the rest of them.
Yeah. It's good to see new, because I guess the one before that was the one from Saw with the mask.
Right. But that, you had what's his name in there, and the little motorcycle, tricycle puppet and such. What was it? John, what's his name? And I can't remember the actual name of the character, but he's not that kind of character. He's not that Michael. You see, what Michael, Jason, Freddy all are is the boogeyman.
Yeah.
And Art the clown is the boogeyman, but he's also the weird, creepy clown. So it hits, that's what's really hitting the current level. And then the extreme gore. Well, it's fascinating. The second week of Joker 2, Art the Clown was number 1. Joker 2 already practically disappeared from the charts by then.
Interesting.
So, yeah, and it's kind of like a battle of the evil clowns, and Art wins. But Art is supernatural. So
could you make a film today that was just run on pure fear, like a real something that's very subdued and just suggests things rather than overt gore, overt imagery? Would it be possible to create a film like that and freak people out? So. Like something like The Haunting, right? Like that kind of film where things are hinted at. I would find something like that way more disturbing.
I think we are going to get there. I'm very interested to see Robert Eggers' version of Nosferatu in a month and a half or so, and see what he does with that. But I think we're going to get there because it's just the times. They are so unpredictable that you don't need to do much. Did you ever see the film that was made after The Exorcist by my brain is skipping on. William Friedkin made The Sorcerer. Did you ever see that?
No, I've heard about it. It's the one with the train or something like that.
Well, it's trucks carrying sweating dynamite through the worst roads in a jungle.
Yes.
And
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
In the middle of that, when I first saw it, again, it was like I heard something. At that time, all the critics hated it. I think everyone was expecting, with a name like Sorcerer, which was just the name of a truck.
Yeah,
everyone was expecting another horror film, and they didn't get that. But it's one of the most tense films I've ever seen. I remember sitting. I just walked in when they started the trek through the jungle with these huge old trucks, and when you realize that any major bump is going to cause their trucks. There's 2 of them, so if one doesn't make it, the other one will. Any major bump could cause the entire truck to explode. It is one of the most tense, suspenseful movies I've ever seen, and I love the film for that. And
I'll go on record
saying French film.
The height of films, in many ways, was the 1970s.
Yes, it was.
Because for something like Apocalypse Now, where they've given this director a ton of money, he's having a nervous breakdown. He doesn't know how he's going to film it. Nothing that chaotic would ever happen now on a big budget. Never.
Right. Yeah, and I feel I'm not alone. A lot of people are really angry at Todd Phillips for making Joker 2 and completely disrespecting who the Joker is as a stock character. And killing him at the end. I'm ruining it.
That's okay. My son, we haven't seen the second one, but my son went with his friends to watch the first one, and I'd shown him Taxi Driver before and showed him King of Comedy after. But remember him coming out of the theater going, "That was the best movie I've ever seen." Right. So yeah, it's
probably not going to say that about this one.
No, I've heard.
Which is what's sad is that it's thrown a bit of shade on the first one now. Because you realize, maybe, I watched the first one right before I went. I hadn't seen it since it came out, but yeah, great film, and I was expecting something similar to it at the end, kind of an explosive end, but no, didn't happen.
There's another interesting thing just about like horror or being obsessed with sort of disturbing things in general. It's a counterbalance to a very safe and comfortable life. So, for example, you got a country like Norway. Norway's got to be one of the safest places in the world to live. And they have this extreme black metal that even took it a step further than death metal,
right?
Where some of the members even went to extreme, some of them got involved in murder and burning down churches.
Right.
Then at the height of like the Iraq Civil War, post-Iraq, after the U.S. invasion and the Sunnis and the Shias were all fighting each other, and it was this most horrific war zone. They're walking around and asking people who their favorite musician is, and it's Lionel Richie. So, people who actually live in real horror don't want to deal with that stuff. But people live in these very safe areas, they start imagining what the horrific world is, right? And
although the greatest periods for horror, I really like German horror in the 1920s. And I think one of the reasons it's so good is because German society was so unpredictable at that point.
Yeah, for sure.
But then the 30s in America was really good. And one of the reasons it was really good, it was the Depression.
Yeah, it was escape.
A period in which it isn't good is the 40s. There are some great films there, but it's literally maybe two handfuls.
Yeah.
And when you get to I have these big, like the Overlook Encyclopedia of Horror, and you get to the 40s, it's just a really thin section. And they try to be really encyclopedic about it. And the reason is what's going on then? World War II.
Yeah.
And then, but at the end of that decade, the last part, suddenly you have film noir, which is a different way of handling the post-war era.
Yeah.
And then you get a lot of kind of jokey horror films and sci-fi films.
Yeah, like Abbott and Costello
in the 50s. And it isn't until the end of the 50s that you start to get the Hammer films. And then you start getting a few strange films like Eyes Without a Face and Diabolique coming out of France. Yeah. Then you get Psycho, and then things really start.
Yeah, Psycho is definitely the birth of the modern horror film, exactly. I would argue. Exactly. And yeah, you get into interesting stuff in the 60s for sure.
Yeah, but it's really the 70s in which now the whole hippie era is now kind of dead, even though nobody's really acknowledging it. But you start, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre is totally saying this is the end of the hippies.
Yeah, for sure. And the film Let's Scare Jessica to Death has that element too.
Yeah.
Them driving around in the hearse with the peace sign,
Exactly.
Yeah, no, and definitely I think that the 70s is just such a great, there's so many great 70s horror films, and we've had a discussion about it.
Right. And also the music in the 70s is quite interesting.
Oh,
and
it's fantastic.
Between the birth of heavy metal and and punk rock and a lot of more standard hard rock and stuff, you really get a real the 70s kind of on that end. But there's another side to the 70s, and it's AM radio, and it's your mainstream, although the mainstream films at that time were pretty dark, Godfather, Exorcist, Dog Day Afternoon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
The difference is in the 70s, I think, for both film and both for a lot of music, there was a lot of freedom given to the artist, and they were selling big numbers. So Led Zeppelin would just make their album. No one was saying, you got to have a hit, you got to do this, you got to do that. And with those directors in the 70s, can you imagine doing The Deer Hunter now with that? How long? It's almost like 45-minute wedding scene. You wouldn't be able to do that now.
No. They got away with that because of The Godfather opening.
Yeah.
And well, now what's interesting is we're seeing the collapse of the blockbuster system.
Yes.
But horror for the last 20, 25 years has remained very strong and has got, to me, like I said, I think this is other strong years. 1999 was important. What else would we say here is a great year for horror? Like 79?
Oh yeah, but the whole from about 78 to about 84, that was the horror.
Yeah, there's a whole period there. But I think this year has been one of the most incredible years I've ever seen. And you should see a few more of them.
I will. I've definitely got to check out a lot more new stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to make a top 10 list at the in a month or so here, because most of them are out for the year. But I was just really impressed, and it kept getting better and better. It started off slow though, but then by May, the gloves were off.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about horror now is the indie stuff doesn't matter much anymore, or the blockbuster stuff, so much of it has been compromised and isn't worth watching. Interestingly, what was a big success this year was Wolverine and Deadpool and Wolverine.
Yeah.
Interesting. I don't know if you saw that, but that was gory as hell. There's a scene there, and it's pure slapstick comedy where Deadpool and Wolverine are going through, and I mean literally through, all of these other Deadpools, and they're pulling them apart, and blood is flying everywhere, and it makes Night of the Living Dead look like just a trip to the Disney World. It's just so crazy. And I'm sitting there going like, well, if this is a comedy and this is a huge mainstream hit, no wonder there's Art the Clown.
Yeah.
You need something that's even more intense. How much of that can we take? I don't know. I do know there's going to be at least one more Art the Clown movie, but I am seeing subtler things as well. But then again, there was nothing particularly subtle about the substance.
Yeah.
And everyone I was watching it with in the theater was going like, you could feel them going, because body stuff gets us squeamish. So, well, I think we've decided horror films are horror films.
Yeah, I don't know if we've actually.
No.
I think
when you look back at the old horror films in the 30s and 50s and such, how do you look at those?
No, those are horror films. Those are definitely horror films, and because most of those have the supernatural element.
Yeah,
that is dark, and it's there's that disorder that needs to be put right, and that's what the horror film is. But I mean, when I grew up, I actually watched a lot of those movies because there used to be a great channel, WUTV out of Buffalo, that showed here, and I used to watch Fright Night, they called it. So I've seen most of those old films that you talk about.
I had shows like that when I was a kid too, which is how I got to know all the Frankenstein movies and all of that stuff. So
no, I definitely include that as the in the lineage. So and I like that stuff too. I think the problem was with some of that was the censorship that was brought in by Hollywood, the Haines Code or whatever.
But I do believe those films will be coming back more than a lot of stuff in between, because they contain this creepy element.
Yeah.
It's all about eerie mood.
That's true. And there's a whole other thing. Maybe this could be another conversation. But what is interesting when you talk about the 50s and you talk about sci-fi, being the main, the bug-eyed monsters and all that, which I like that stuff too, but it's obviously very campy. But that's the era of EC Comics and all these other horror comics that appear on the time, which are so extreme.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I have not original ones, but I have reprinted ones, and I actually want to do a show on both 50s horror comics and 70s horror comics.
Right.
I'll get around.
I bought the first issue of Creepy magazine and Vampirella when they came out in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And the first issue of Creepy actually freaked me out.
Yeah,
I'd never seen anything like that before. So.
Yeah, because they did it because it was a magazine. It got past the comic code. Yeah.
Then there's another question. I'm just going to throw this out. Don't answer it. But I've heard people today look back and you'll say something like, the Beatles were rock music. And they go, no, they weren't. I'm just leaving that there as a future subject.
Okay. What is rock? Isn't even hard. That's a much bigger category.
Exactly. Okay, James. Well, thanks for joining me today. Be kind to the students, unless they're really stupid and need to be learned.
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Bern. It's always a pleasure, and take care. And
have a good rest of your day.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay. So, that's it. That is the discussion. I thought it was pretty interesting. Did we decide for sure what horror is? Not really, because it's a very hard thing, as all things are. But it's a hard thing to define. But my definition, I think, is a bit more expansive. I tend to say to people, if you go to the Overlook Encyclopedia of Horror and Supernatural, I would go along with that book. I would also go along with the Penguin Encyclopedia of Horror and as well. So, yeah, there we are. Okay. I will see you again, or you will see me. I can't see you through here, but you'll see my flickering digital image here from Tbilisi, where we say Droibit, which means, yeah, temporarily. We will meet again. Nachwamdis.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.